Welcome everybody to the execution/torture method iceberg. Throughout history, there have been no shortage of execution and torture methods. So in this video, we'll be taking a look at different ways people have punished and harmed others throughout history. In the iceberg, there was some that I felt were left out, so I added them into their corresponding tier that I thought that they fit. And the different methods range in severity, so I'm gonna issue a content warning now because they can get quite disturbing and awful to hear about, so viewers' discretion is advised. One last thing, I would like to give a shout out to, Ray Fugel 3, I think I'm pronouncing that right, on Reddit, for he is the creator of this iceberg, so thank you for that. And also a shout out to Wendigoon for the inspiration for this video. I will be linking all of his socials and his YouTube link in the description, as well as the link to the iceberg as well if you want to check it out for yourself. And with all that being said, let's get started. So the first few tiers are your more well-known execution methods. So we won't be spending too much time here. I'm pretty much gonna just combine the first few ones, and I won't like I said, I won't spend too much time here because of how well-known they are. And so starting off on these first few tiers, we have lethal injection. So lethal injection is a practice of injecting one or more drugs into the person to provide an extremely rapid death. Lethal injection is the primary method of execution in the United States, and 31 states authorize the use of lethal injection. And since 1976, there have been 1,360 deaths due to lethal injection. Firing squad is a method of capital punishment, particularly found in the military and during times of war. And it's a fairly old practice in which a group of military personnel simultaneously shoot a person or a group of people for their execution. They all fire at the same time to not only avoid failure, but to cause confusion as to who made the final kill shot. And then the shooters are instructed to aim at the heart to avoid head disfigurement from too many blows to the head. The gas chamber is mostly known for its use by Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. A gas chamber consists of a sealed chamber into which a poisonous or asphyxiant gas is then introduced, including hydrogen cyanide, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and etc. The gas chamber was an excellent way to do away with multiple people, an abundance of people all at one time. And due to its use by Nazi Germany, I'm fairly certain that it is abolished everywhere, but don't quote me on that. And if it's not, it definitely should be, because of how it was used in the past. Beheading is another form of execution, and it is where the head is completely severed from the body. And most of the time an axe would be used, but giant swords and most notably the guillotine were also used. Electrocution, which is performed via the electric chair, is another method of execution in which a person is strapped to a wooden chair, a specially built wooden chair, and shocked with volts of electricity. Once strapped, various cycles of alternating currents would pass through the body, causing fatal organ failure. The first would be a more powerful jolt, causing cardiac arrest and unconsciousness, and the second being a less powerful jolt, but that is what would cause those failures, the organ failures. It was once the most popular execution method, but has since been surpassed by the aforementioned lethal injection. For the final method in the first few tiers we have is hanging. So hanging, once again, is another method of execution. This is in which a person is hanged by a noose or a ligature that would be strapped around the neck. There are a few different ways that you can be hanged, and I will explain them. The first one we have is the short drop, where a person would be standing on, say, a box or a chair, and that object would be removed, and then they would fall, and then, the hanging would commence. Next, we have the pole method, which is where a person would be strapped up against a pole with a ligature around their armpits and their waist, and then another like a noose or another ligature would be strapped around their neck and placed on top of the pole. And then, kind of like the short drop, there would be like an object underneath them holding them up, and then once you kick that object, they would fall. And it's basically just another form of the short drop but the short drop just is just the noose and ligature. Pole has the pole. So next we have the standard drop, which is the standard. A person would be dropped from 20 feet and in hopes of a neck breaking, and if not that, they would just hang there. And finally we have the long drop, which is where a person's height and weight would be measured to ensure enough slack on the rope for when they are dropped down, it would 100% ensure that their neck would be broken. So this was considered more humane than, say, a short drop or a long drop, which I don't agree with. I think they're all, you're hanging somebody. I don't really think that's humane at all, but I digress. So starting with tier 3, we have beheaded by knife. I couldn't find anything on this, so I'm just assuming that this can go in with beheading, because it's literally just a different way to behead somebody. So instead of getting your head chopped off by a giant axe or the guillotine, you're just getting your head probably slowly and methodically sliced off by a knife. The following execution is quite simple. People executed like this are either thrown or dropped just from extremely high heights, and their death would come from the high speeds as they were hitting the ground. Stoning, once again, is another form of capital punishment in which a person would be stoned to death. They would get thrown rocks and stones at them until they died. They were usually buried either neck or waist deep into the ground to restrict movement, and they would most likely die, and not most likely, they would die from the blunt force trauma infused by the rocks and the stones. So whipping, or often referred to as flagellation or flogging, is a method of torture and execution in which a person is beaten with either whips like rods and switches, etc. This is one of our first instances of torture on the iceberg, and can also lead to execution, as it takes hundreds of whips to kill a person, which is, I am assuming, is where the 100 whip comes from in the naming of the iceberg. This act was implemented immensely during the slavery of African American people, and although it is low on the tier list, I wholeheartedly believe that it is one of the worst things that you can do to a human being, and I am extremely happy that it has been abolished since the early 1900s. Since the mid 1900s, which is crazy to think about, how it took that long for this thing to be abolished as a whole. Ridiculous. Moving on to tier 4, we will start with burial alive, or being buried alive. So being buried alive or premature burial is exactly as it says. It's the act of burying someone before they pass. While sometimes it is accidental, throughout history it has been proven that people will bury you alive for execution purposes and torture methods. So drowning is pretty much self-explanatory. The offended would be drowned for their actions, but there's also another form of drowning known as the drowning pit. So the drowning pit was a well or a pond, some being up to 80 feet deep. It was specifically used to execute women and girls under the Scottish feudal laws. And on very, very, very rare occasions, a man would be sentenced to drowning. And so the woman would climb down a ladder, and the ladder would be withdrawn. And then after an amount of time, whether that be long or short, it would result in these women's, and very sometimes men's, drowning. So the Catherine wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, was one of the most cruelest forms of torture and execution in history. A person would be strapped to a wheel, and their executioners would beat them with iron clubs and beat their limbs and break their bones. Bones would be crushed, and they would basically be turned into gigantic human-sized screaming muppets. It was used to crush the offended limbs and bones and keep them alive and prolong the torture for days to ensure that they felt the pain. After days of torture, the executioners would enforce their final blows, known as the coup de grace, where they would take their iron clubs and whatnot and hit them extremely hard on the chest, which would result in their death. And this was an extremely common form of execution and torture, and has since been abolished since 1836, thankfully, because this one is extremely cruel. While the breaking wheel was cruel, Ling Chi is one of the most terrifying. So Ling Chi, translating to slow slicing or lingering death, was a torture method that was, as the name suggests, long and painful. The victim would be tied down to a wooden post, and their executioners would deliver a series of cuts to their body. They would start with the chest and get to removing their breasts and until their rib cage was exposed. Next, they would cut away at the arms and cut down to the tissue and cut portions out of their arms, and then they would move down to their legs doing the exact same thing. By the time they got to the legs, the victims would have been dead by then, but some did survive. Some of the victims only lasted 15 minutes. Others would last up until like 3,000 cuts, being hours worth of torment and torture to their body. After you die, they would decapitate you, and this method was said to be used as punishment in this lifetime and the next lifetime because of their spiritual beliefs, that they felt if they hurt you that bad in this lifetime, it would carry over into your next lifetime. Rounding out tier 4, we have the garrote. I don't know how to pronounce it, to be honest. So the garrote is, once again, another form of execution. It's a weapon, usually being a ligature of scarf, fishing line, rope, chain, etc., and it was used as a strangulation device. It consists of an iron collar that would be strapped around the person's neck, and the collar would be tightened very slowly, resulting in the person's strangulation. Originally, they would strap them in the garrote, and they would, instead of pretty much choking them to death, they would hit them really, really hard on the head, so they wouldn't be able to move. But instead of just choking them, they would hit them, and then the blow to the head would cause their death. But over time, it developed into the garrote now that we know today as a strangulation device. Starting out tier 5, we have one of the most notorious methods of execution in history. The brazen bull, while being awful, is one of my favorite. Is one of my favorite methods of execution and torture on the entire iceberg. So basically, a bull would be sculpted, a fully sized bull would be sculpted out of bronze, and there would be one door on the side. And so what would happen is a person would be tied up or just thrown in there and locked inside. And so once they're inside, underneath the bull would be a fire, and they would light the fire, and it would begin to heat the bull up and start to cook the person that was inside. And so it would cook them until they were roasted to death. And inside of the brazen bull was an acoustic apparatus where whenever they would scream, I know this sounds awful, but whenever they would scream, it would play the sound of a low octave, like bellow of a bull. So as they were screaming, it would the bull would sound like it itself was screaming as a bull, which is extremely terrifying. If you were the executioner in this scenario, I'd be traumatized. Honestly, it's extremely terrifying. So death by burning, or also known as immolation, is just that, being burned to death. As your body burns, you'd suffocate in the smoke of the fire as well. So not only are you getting third-degree burns all over your body, you are also being asphyxiated from the smoke of the fire, and you'd just begin to suffocate. And so most of the time, you'd suffocate before the burns were to kill you. And so, luckily enough for them, they didn't have to endure all of that pain. In this manner, throughout history, this has been used a lot for execution, but it was most notably used during the Salem witch trials, in which condemned witches were burned at the stake. Death by boiling is another method of torture that is slow and painful. The victim would be dipped into a boiling hot liquid and basically turned into a human stew. They were usually carried out in like a large vessel, like a cauldron, and they were water, oil, and tar, and etc. were used as the liquid. These liquids would leave third-degree burns all over your body, and your organs would begin to cook inside of you as this is going on. And it is said that you would be able to smell your insides as they were being cooked, which is another terrifying thing to think about. Being crushed by an elephant, it puts unusual and cruel and unusual punishment. Just the thought of being stomped on by an elephant just gives me chills, because that would hurt so bad. But it was a common method of execution in Southeast Asia, and so what would happen is not only were these elephants, but they were versatile, and now they could kill you in one stomp if they wanted to, or they were trained to also prolong this torture by stepping on like one limb at a time and having you be tortured for multiple days by stepping on different parts of your body, and they were very maniacal with it, or maniacal with it. Not only is the thought of, like I said, being crushed by an elephant scary, but being crushed by an intelligent, wild, trained animal, that sounds, I don't know why, but it just makes it sound completely worse. Impalement is a method of torture in which a person is penetrated by a stake, pole, spear, etc. through the anus to the mouth. Yeah. The stakes would be as, like, think about you trying to grab like a pole with two hands and it won't be able to fit. That's how thick these stakes were. And so what they would do is they would drive the stakes into the ground, and then with the blunt end, like the blunt end of it, they would insert you onto it. And so sometimes they would smear it with oil or fat or grease to make it easier, and if it didn't fit, they would slit your to make it fit. And then the victim would be lowered onto the stake, and the stake would push all of your organs to the side because it was blunt, and that would cause like rips and tears within your body. And what they would do is they would impale you until your tippy toes were touching the ground, so that you would have to hold your body up for as long as possible. And once you, which prolonged the torture and execution, obviously. And once you finally end up giving out and slipping, that is when the rest of the stake would be penetrated through to your mouth. The euthanasia coaster is a roller coaster designed to kill its passengers. The ride is a 3-minute ride and would begin with a 2-minute slow ride to the apex of 1,600 feet. So after it hit the 1,600 feet, it would hit an extreme downward plunge into 7 strategically placed loops, and these loops would take about 1 minute to get through. So as the loops go, they are getting smaller in diameter, and what are they to do? What they are to do is exert gravitational force on the body and force all of your blood and air to the bottom half of your body, to your legs, so that it would leave your brain with no oxygen. And the final loop flattened out to allow for the bodies to be taken off of the coaster and to put new ones on. The method is a concept / hypothetical and is said to be a humane death of elegance and euphoria. While not only being a painless death, it would be a fun, enjoyable, and beautiful one, according to its creator. So bamboo torture is one that I actually added in because I felt like it should be mentioned. So bamboo torture was reportedly used in East and Southeast Asia. Bamboo grows immensely fast, like I'm talking multiple feet in a single day. So what they would do is they would strap their victims down onto the ground and over bamboo shoots. The sharpened shoots would then start growing, and they would start impaling the body and going through in different parts. So slowly and very painfully, as they were going through, they would come up and shoot out, like I said, through different parts of the body. And so eventually there would be literally like multiple. So literally there would eventually be multiple like stalks of bamboo just coming out of a person's body. So death would be inevitable and slow. So reportedly Japanese soldiers used these on U.S. captives of World War II. But although they're reportedly, there isn't much reliable evidence that it happened. And I think that it was worth mentioning. And so finishing tier 5, we have the gridiron. So the gridiron was the act of broiling somebody alive on a grate over a bed of hot coals. This death would be slow and painful once again, kind of like the brazen bull, in which you are being cooked alive. But here, some people would be drenched in oil to ensure a proper boiling and a proper cooking. But good thing, it's not good that they died, but it's a good thing that they didn't eat them afterwards, which I assumed when I first read that they oiled them up before cooking them, but I was thankful to hear that they did not eat them afterwards. So starting out tier 6, we have kneel hauling. And so kneel hauling was used by sailors at sea as a torture method, and sometimes ended in execution. So what would happen is a sailor would be tied to a loop and thrown overboard over a ship and would be dragged underneath the keel of the ship. And so the hull, like the bottom portion of the ship, would be covered in razor sharp barnacles and other marine life, and they would be tossed over and drug all the way across over and over again, and it would result in lacerations over the entire body. And this right here is what would cause the death, is all these lacerations, and you'd get infected as well, and other, and like etc. and stuff like that. But sometimes if the victim was dragged too slowly, his weight or their weight would be too much for the thing to handle, and it would result in their drowning, which is the execution portion of it. Also known as the punishment of the sack, Poena Culi. Don't butcher me in the comments, but I'm sorry if I pronounced that badly. But it is a quite specific form of execution. So first, the condemned would be whipped and beaten, and then they would be sewn into a large leather sack. And within this sack would be a few animals. They would throw a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster in there with you, and they would toss you out into a body of water. And so what would happen is, if these animals didn't kill you, it would result in a drowning pretty much every time. So it's a lose-lose situation. So you either die from being your face ripped off by a monkey, you getting eaten alive by a snake, you getting pecked to hell by a rooster, or you getting just destroyed by a dog, or you drown. So yeah, lose-lose situation here. I don't think there's a survivability rate, and it's very, very specific and very unique, and it begs the question of how anybody thought of this in the first place, and how they caught these snakes, and why they did this. I don't know. I don't know, man. Crucifixion is a very well-known method of capital punishment thanks to the story of Jesus Christ. Firstly, the condemned would be beaten and whipped an immense amount, and in some instances they were forced to carry their stakes, which would weigh upwards to 300 pounds to their execution site. In crucifixion, a person would be strapped, or would either be tied or nailed to a wooden beam, or in Jesus' case, a cross, and they would be left to hang there for their eventual death. And most of the time they would break the legs of the crucified so that they couldn't keep their weight up, and so instead of them having a way to push their weight onto, they would literally just be dangling there until their death. It was mainly used by the Romans and has been abolished since like 4 AD, since 4th century AD, well after it was used for 500 years. And so not only was it a form of execution, it was also a form of humiliation. Disembowelment is the removal of some, and in some instances, the removal of all of the organs of the bowels and or viscera. I said and or viscera. The victim would typically be awake conscious during the entire evisceration, and if any vital organs were not damaged, they would be not only in extreme pain, but they would be able to see their insides being taken out of them. This death was long, and is another long and painful form of execution. So eventually the victims would die of blood loss, but there's also an intentional disembowelment as well. This being the removal of like the heart and lungs, or in some cases just being decapitated, and it would just result in a very fast death. The pendulum was an instrument of both torture and execution. So what would happen is an axe would be lowered slowly, descending slowly, and it would swing back and forth until it would get to your stomach. Now this was used as an interrogation method to invoke answers out of somebody. But if someone didn't answer, oh boy, you're in for a treat. So what would happen is, if they didn't get the confession they wanted, they would bring the axe all the way down until it made contact with the flesh of the stomach, and it would continue to cut deeper and deeper into the torso. And so it would continuously pierce through the flesh of their stomach until their eventual death from torso injuries. And so in that instance, just admit to whatever you did. There's no reason that you need to go out like this. I don't care what you did or how hardcore you are. Just admit, man. It's not worth getting axed through the stomach. I promise you. Another one that I added is the Swedish drink. The Swedish drink, also alternatively known as Sweden trunk. In the Swedish drink method, a person would be forced to swallow disgusting, like large amounts of foul liquid, that being excrements and urine and manure and etc. And because of this, like this force feeding and forced swallowing of all this stuff, their stomachs would become largely bloated. And if an interrogator didn't get, just like the pendulum, if the interrogator didn't get what they wanted out of them, they would stomp on their stomachs, causing extreme pain, or even have horses trample over them, causing even more pain. And so this is very gross, very painful. I just thought it needed a mention, and I am moving on. Lastly, in tier 6, we have skinning, and I can assume that you understand what that is. So skinning, or also known as flaying, is the act of literally skinning somebody or flaying somebody. So kind of like how you do a fish and then there's scales. Yeah, instead of thinking of scales, think of that as like human flesh. So these actions would happen as they were alive, and a person would be tied down, hands above the head and the legs tied together. The torture would begin with flaying the face, taking chunks out, and trying to pull it all off as one piece. Yeah, and so this procedure was very slow and methodical, and what they would try to do is try to take off the skin all as one piece, like in the face. They would try to take the skin off in one piece, and most only survived until the torso, in which they would obviously die. And some people, of the executioners would put the victims in a hot broiling sun to make the skinning and flaying easier. So the act of flaying and skinning is one of my least favorite things on this entire iceberg. I know we're only in tier 6, but it's just so disturbing and how a person could do that to another person, and it's just really gross and frightening. And I am done talking about it, and moving on to tier 7. So starting with tier 7 is tied to the mouth of a cannon, and I can expect you understand what this means next. So a person would be strapped and tied to the mouth of a cannon, and the cannon would be shot off. And so what would happen is the head would be boom. And so what would happen is the head would go up tens of feet in the air, and it would also blow off like the upper torso of the body as well. And so this would obviously result in a decapitation, and this one is very, very gruesome. And when you think about it, I try not to explain it like that, but it's extremely brutal and very, very very gruesome. It was also often used as a mass thing, so multiple people at the same time would die to this. And so yeah, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Strapato, or also known as corda, is a form of torture where a person would be strapped, like their arms would be strapped behind their back and their legs would be strapped together, and they would be hanging, and they'd be strapped by some sort of ligature and rope, and they'd be hanging like this. So yeah, they'd be suspended by their wrists very high in the sky. And so what this would do, it would result in a shoulder dislocation, and very painful, obviously. And weights would also be added on to cause more pain to the victim. And so this torture generally wouldn't even last an hour, because most people wouldn't even survive the 60 minutes. Once again, another painful, another awful one. I mean, I can't imagine being strung up with my arms behind my back and then dislocating. Like, God, that's gotta be fucking painful. Jesus Christ. Moving on, we have one of the few instances of psychological torture being white room torture, or also known as white torture. It's a psychological torture that utilizes a sensory deprivation. So it's used to make the prisoner lose all senses of identity. In white room torture, the prisoner is deprived of all color, meaning the entire cell would be white. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything would be white. Everything they were fed was white rice on white plates. All of the white rice, unseasoned white rice, actually, to deprive the sense of smell, and just unseasoned white rice also to deprive the sense of taste, on white plates, obviously. And all of the surfaces in these rooms, in these cells, would be smoothed down to deprive the sense of touch. Clothes as well were all white, and there was neo tubes above them to deprive them of any shadows as well. And also, this cell and rooms were soundproof, and the guards would wear soundproof and like padded shoes so that they wouldn't make any noise. So basically the prisoners would only be able to hear themselves. Prisoners are usually kept in these conditions for months, and almost in some instances for years in these conditions. Typically they become depersonalized, and this results in psychotic breaks and hallucinations. Death by sawing is one of the most brutal forms of execution and torture that is in the entire iceberg, and is also featured in the film Terrifier in an extremely difficult scene to watch. So what would happen next is, like I said, extremely gruesome, and so if you want to skip this one, go ahead. I won't mind, because I really don't want to be here either. So what would happen is a person would be stripped and hung upside down from their legs, one leg here, and they'd be hung upside down and their arms tied behind their back. And so what would happen is either one person or two people would begin to saw the person in half from their pelvis all the way down to their head. Like I said, extremely gruesome. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Moving on. Drawing and quartering is one of the most infamous methods of torture and execution throughout history. The victim would be drawn, meaning he'd be tied to horses and dragged to the gallows, after which he would be hanged and in some instances disemboweled or even beheaded. Afterward, they would be quartered, and that being their limbs would each be strapped to a different horse, and all the horses would run in a completely different direction and pulling your body apart, pretty much like a Mortal Kombat fatality. This is again an extremely unfortunate and brutal way to perish, and I am very glad to hear that it has been abolished since 1867, which is still a little too early in time. It shouldn't have happened at all, but I'm just glad it's gone. So Kisos and Reitsu, I'm assuming that's their pronunciations. I literally didn't find anything on them. So I don't know what they're doing here on the iceberg. If anyone else knows, can they please explain it to me? So instead of those, we'll be rounding out tier 7 with Judas's Cradle. Alright, here we go. Okay. I did add this one in. I probably shouldn't have, because I get squeamish even thinking about it. But Judas's Cradle is another awful method of torture and execution. So it consists of a pyramid-like wooden device that would be inserted into a person's behind or a woman's, you can infer. So the victim's hands would be tied, I'm not sure where, but they'd be tied, and the legs would be tied in a certain way to inflict more pain onto them. And so yes, like I said, the pyramid would be inserted into there, you know what, and this torture would last for days, literally days, of them just sitting in grieving pain on this pyramid. But the time, sometimes, but in the time that they would be in the Judas Cradle, just completely dependent on their ability to withstand the pain. And sometimes they would even place oil on the pyramid to induce more pain onto their victims. And the device was also never washed, so with each use there would be different infections and gross things like that would be contracted from it. So even if you survived the days or however much time you were in there, even if you survived that, you're still not going to survive it because of the infections that you would have been receiving. So it's literally a lose situation here. So yeah, even if you would survive, you would be stricken with a disease. I don't know why I added this one on. I guess it's kind of cool. Not really. Moving on. Starting in the final tier, that being tier 8, we have the Blood Eagle. Blood eagle is so cruel and grisly that it's kind of hard to believe that it was even a thing. The victim's hands and legs were tied to restrict any movement, and then the executioner would stab the victim from the lower back and drag it up to the rib cage area. As they got to the rib cage, each rib would be meticulously removed from their body, or meticulously separated from the backbone, which left the internal organs on full display. And after that, the executioner would pull the lungs out and spread them like an eagle's wing. So your rib cage would be like poked out here, and then your lungs would be out like an eagle, like eagle wings. Regardless whether this was a literary invention or a real life torture method, this is still extremely gruesome and extremely disgusting, and it is no doubt a stomach churning torture and execution method. So I'm gonna repeat that. I really shouldn't, but I'm gonna repeat it. Cut from the tailbone to the rib cage would be poked out, and lungs would be strapped like eagle's wings. Gross. Next up, we have the Kim Jong-un uncle's execution. I don't know why it's in tier 8, but whatever. So the Kim Jong-un's uncle execution is referring to exactly that, the execution of Kim Jong-un's uncle. It was reportedly that he ordered the death of him because he was a traitor. And one way that he was reportedly killed was that he was fed to hungry dogs alive. Now this is all speculation, as one source claimed that it was more of a satirical report. So it's kind of hard to believe that happened. Another report was that he was decapitated, and his body was his headless body was placed in front of North Korean high order North Korean officials. Once again, I don't know. I'm not buying it. And then a final report says that he died to firing squad, which is most likely, in my opinion, the most likely method that he perished. He was sentenced to death. So I don't know why this one's in tier 8. It's not really gruesome or anything like that. I'd put this more like in tier 3 or 4, but I didn't make it. It's whatever. Moving on. Scaphicism. Oh god. Okay, so scaphicism is a method of torture and execution in which a person would be stripped naked, strapped to a boat, smeared with milk and honey, and then force-fed milk and honey as well. And so what would happen is they would be pushed out onto stagnant water, and all of these insects from the water would begin to feast on their flesh, and so yeah, they would begin to feast on their flesh and eat them, and because of this milk and honey, it would cause their bodies to have diarrhea, and when the victims relieved themselves, it would bring these insects would begin to breed inside of the excrements and the wounds, and so that would create even more bugs to come and eat them and eat these victims. So the feces would become just basically a field day of breeding, just a breeding ground for the insects to just keep producing more and more bugs to eat them alive. And so not only would they just continue to feed, but like I said, they would continue to breed over and over again within the excrements. Nobody deserves this. I don't think anybody deserves to be force-fed milk and honey to begin with. But just the fact that they're being eaten alive, insects over and over and over again is just an awful thing to think about. And so, yeah, no one deserves this. I'm moving on now. Immurement is a claustrophobic person's worst nightmare. So during this method, a victim is sealed in either a coffin-like a room or just like encased in a stone wall or something like that, which is just a room with no exits. And so when it was used as a means of execution, a prisoner would just be simply left to die from dehydration and starvation. This form of execution is different than being buried alive, because typically when you are buried alive, you die from asphyxiation and suffocation. And so immurement was typically used as capital punishment, but in an even more horrid and cruel way it was used was also as human sacrifice. So basically, to those that were sacrificing it would bring good fortune to them as they were sacrificing this victim or this person. So whether used as a punishment or human sacrifice, and a mere can literally only be summed up as an example of one of the unspeakable and one of the many cruelties that numerous cultures are guilty of doing in the past, and that they practiced for way too far long. A lot of these practices were in the iceberg were used for far too long, and people got away with this for way too long, and it really sucks to see all of these different ways people have perished and been basically murdered and tortured throughout history. And it does suck to learn about these things, but in a way it's a good thing that they happen. Now that we know that they happen, we can steer away from them. And some of them are very specific and really weird in how they were created, like the sack. I don't know how they created that one, but just stuff like that. I don't know why they were carried out for so long. And on that note, that is the end of the iceberg. Thank you for giving me your time and attention. I really do appreciate the watch and or the listen. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and comment if I should do more of these like iceberg type videos. I have done one other one, not really an iceberg, but it was a video on horror genres and a chart of the horror genres, and I just explained them briefly. Thank you again for watching. I really do appreciate it. Like I said, the watch and the listen, I really do. I hold that deep in my heart. I do enjoy when people watch the content that I create. And with all that being said, thank you for watching. If you enjoy my content, there's plenty of videos on the channel. I'm relatively new, but there's plenty of videos on the channel that you can go ahead and check out if you enjoyed my personality or just my way of explaining things. And so yeah, thank you once again for watching, for listening. I hope you have a splendid day, splendid night. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.